Hello, everyone. This is Edward Tamesian. I'm the Vice President of Internet Infidels, and I have a paper that was accepted for publication 2 years ago on the origin of evil and theistic hard determinism that anyone can view online. And today, for the third time today, I'm going to be interviewing the legendary Bill Gaede. And he has his own personal website, and you can all check that out. I will put a link to the website on the description part of the video when this gets distributed. And for our first question today, we are going to be talking about Einstein's train paradox. So, Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit about this paradox and what you see are the problems with it?
Well, we got to start with that famous word time. Oh man, that word time is a monster. The first thing we have to be aware of is that in the last 3,000 years, no one has been able to define the word time. If you look it up, the first thing you'll find out there, well, we don't really know what it means. We don't know how to define it. And then they go on and use it. And that's the first thing. The second problem, just as bad maybe, is that they've converted time, whatever that thing is, because they couldn't define it, they converted it into a physical object. That's exactly what has happened. They have reified this concept. So what happens? Whenever they give you a physical interpretation, right? This is the official special relativity, especially, right? But general relativity in general. What they do when we have two parts. We have the mathematical parts where they put time, the value of time, 5 seconds or whatever, into an equation to describe something that happened. That's on the one hand. And on the other, you have the situation where they have to give you a physical interpretation of what that equation represents.
Gotcha.
So what happens? When that happens, that's when they get into trouble because they say, well, we're going to dilate time. We're going to travel through time. And it's all these things, they stretch time. So you ask a simple question. You say, why doesn't the Earth fly out of the solar system? Very simple question. I mean, you would think any physicist would tell you and say, this is the reason it doesn't fly out of the solar system. The explanation given by general relativity in this instance, right, is that time is warped. And you say, hold it, what do you mean time? What can that possibly mean? What do you mean time is warped? And that's what they're doing here, essentially, they have this fishnet because they're going to give you the physical interpretation now. Forget about the equations now, right? Now they're going to give you the physical interpretations of what the equation represents. At least this is their interpretation of that equation, right? In physical terms. And what they do, they say, look, there's this canvas we call space-time, unimaginable space-time, because it's 4-dimensional, meaning one of those dimensions, the fourth one is time. And they're going to warp this canvas, and that canvas represents this concept called space-time, which somehow converted into a physical object. And that's how they're going to explain why the Earth, or what prevented the Earth from flying out of the solar system. There's this roulette-like mechanism, a depression, and the Earth rolls around it like like a little ball around a roulette. So we have two issues. One, the definition of time. And the other one is that they casually convert time into a physical object. They reify the concept. And then to top it off, they say at the end of their presentation, they say, oh, by the way, don't take our analogies too literally.
Yeah. What am I supposed to imagine then? Yeah, that's a good point.
What did that all mean? What was all that about?
Oh, well. Yeah, false advertisement.
This is the starting point. Okay, this is the starting point. Now you ask a specific question about, time dilation. Okay.
Yeah, that train paradox video. Yeah.
We have the train paradox, and I'll give you a quick analogy that puts everything into the proper focus. Okay. Yeah. These people are saying that when you and I shake hands, we did not do it at the same time.
Yeah. That's because what it sounds like.
You had a different impression than me. Okay.
Yeah.
So for you, it happened at 2:00. For me, it happened at 3:00. That's more or less what they're saying. When we shake hands, it didn't happen simultaneously. Yeah. That's more or less what we've got here. They're saying, look, you've got a train. Okay. And train this, I think this was, I don't know who's the first one to come up with this analogy. Maybe it was Einstein, I don't know. But the issue is when you look at time dilation, you got to go back all the way to Lorentz and Poincaré and other people of the 19th century when Albert Einstein was still in his shorts. He was a kid at the time, okay? These people were already talking about time dilation, these notions that came up really towards the end of the 19th century, right? And continued on to when Einstein took over and got all the credit for it. That is a reality. He did not come up with all these ideas. Maybe he perfected them, maybe he put them in nice and neat in a way that others understood it, but he was not the originator of these ideas. That has to be said just from the historical record. So what are these people saying? What they're saying is you have a train and you have a passenger on the train, okay? And the train is moving towards the station. And let's assume that it doesn't even stop at the station. It just continues rolling. So nonstop train, it's the express, okay? So the train goes by and you have a person standing on the platform looking at the train. That observer, let's call him the stationary observer, and you have the other one moving with the train. He's the moving observer, okay? Now, it's a rainy day. We have two lightning bolts that simultaneously, at the same time, hit the front and back of the train. So let's assume we had the watch that God has up there. They both hit exactly at the same time, one on the front, one on the back of the train.
Yeah, that's what the observer sees from far away, yeah.
Okay, so and now that's what the platform guy sees. The guy who's stationary, he would see those bolts strike at the same time. Yeah. However, the passenger sees something different. He's moving in the direction of the bolt that hits on the front of the train. So as he's moving, the light from that event will hit his eyes faster or sooner than the light from the bolt that hit the rear of the train because he's moving away from it. So if you were to look at the two trajectories of light, you would see the one on the front of the train is shorter and the one on the back of the train is longer. Okay. So as far as the passenger on the train, he sees the front of the train being hit before the one on the back, and the platform guy, the guy who's stationary, who is more objective in this situation, I guess, sees them both hit at the same time. Okay. So they say, look, it all depends on how you measure things when they're moving. Yeah. And that's when they have this relativity, that all is relative.
Yeah.
What are they all talking about? They're talking about measurements. They're not talking about what actually happened under Mother Nature's world. They're talking about what people measure.
Yeah.
Right? So we have a difference between what actually happened, which is what Mother Nature knows. She's got it in her file cabinet. She knows for sure whether they hit at the same time or at different times. And then we have the version of humans, which has to do with measurement, that says one observer will measure one thing and the other guy will measure something else. Opinion. Okay. And that's essentially what we have here. We have a comparison of what actually happened, which we don't know because we can't reproduce the event again. Only Mother Nature, God, the devil, one of those guys knows exactly. They have it in their filing cabinet and we have no access to that filing cabinet. And then you have the human version, which is this is what I measured. And what they're talking about is essentially measurement of light. Okay. And they're saying, look, if we put light as a constant, 300,000 kilometers per second, rounding off, right? If that's a constant, everything else has to change in an equation, And so if we have a difference in observers and the speed of light is the same, well, then the time for one will be different than the time for the other, because we do have that constant, which we can't change, which is the speed of light. And that also has a sequel, which is that people are saying, well, the speed of light is not constant. A lot of people say that, right? It's not a constant. And Einstein proved it, but he could be wrong. And, they go through all these arguments. But the point is that officially the speed of light is a constant, travels at a constant speed. And when you put that into the equation, you will see that what changes are the length of an object, the mass of an object, and the time that it took to cover a certain distance. So that's a situation with time dilation.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And like you were saying, you know, and like I was thinking as well, like either the lightning hit both sides simultaneously or it didn't. You can't say it did and it didn't. You know, that's a contradiction. Like, you know, so you proposed, I think, in your You Stupid Relativists website, you had a page where you concocted an experiment and you were like, so a perfect machine is inside of the train, and if it and we strap Einstein and put something over his mouth and put him in a chair, and if the machine detects lightning hitting both sides simultaneously, Einstein gets zapped, but if it detects lightning hitting one side before the other, then he lives. Like, and like, you know, obviously it's either the machine, you know, isn't based upon perception, or, you know, it's not going to go off of, you know, trajectory of light hitting it first. Like, it's going to measure things objectively. Like, either it's going to detect both sides being hit simultaneously or it won't. So like, that's the way you solve the paradox and show like both observers can't be correct, because that's a contradiction to say it hit both sides and then didn't hit both sides. Like, that's just not how things happen. Like, either it did or it didn't. So that was a good little thought experiment you could concoct, you know, putting that machine like in the train. And then and then, you know, Bill goes into more detail on his website. Like I said, I'll post a link to that. So that was an interesting thought experiment there. And
there's a follow-up on that thought experiment, related, doesn't have to do specifically with that, but it has to do with time dilation. Again, the issue of simultaneity, right? And that's the famous twin paradox.
Okay.
And in this case, you've got this again, a thought experiment. They say, look, one of the twins, travels out of the Earth, goes around a black hole, goes around the universe, comes back, and he finds that his brother has aged. His brother looks like a grandfather, and the guy who traveled still looks like a kid or a young guy. So this guy has 40 more years on him. This guy is still 20 years old. That's more or less the idea. And again, it's because they do math and they forget about physics. Again, mathematical physics has nothing to do with physics. And you can see because they arrive at irrational conclusions. And the way I solved this one, more or less along the lines of good old Andy being sat in this chair and being zapped by electricity. Here we have a similar situation, and this is the way I try to attack this notion that one traveler would stay young, the traveler would stay young, and his twin brother would age. And I'm saying we've got a problem, and the problem is as follows: how do we count years? I mean, we're going to talk about this guy's 40 years older than this guy in time-wise, right? By the clock. How do we determine the year? If you look up the word year, right, the definition, it's one circle of the earth around the sun. Now, I don't care how many years this guy traveled. I don't care how many, what each one has in his head. I need to know objectively how many times the earth went around the sun. Now, it either went around the sun 20 times or 60 times, right? We can't have it both ways. And so if this guy travels outside the universe, if he wants, he can travel to heaven and back for all I care. When he comes back, the number of times the earth went around the sun has to be either 20 or 60. It can't be both.
Yeah.
Okay? And so he can't say, well, the earth had 60 years, but for me, it only had 20 years. No, this is very simple. We just have to count how many times the earth went around the sun, and one of the two is wrong.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's a good way to do it. All righty. Well, thanks a lot for that input. And then for our final question for today, if everyone didn't know, in our last interview, we talked about Bill Gaede's previous life as a Cuban spy and how he eventually moved to the United States and ended up working with a counter-espionage mission with the FBI and CIA to obtain data from Intel. and he talked about the history of that. And this has been featured on Fox News. Bill Gaede has a segment on his website that featured, when this ordeal was happening and stuff like that, and his responses and everything. And today we were going to finish up and talk about an individual by the name of Captain Jose Pepe. And so, what affiliation do you have with, or did have with Captain Jose Pepe, and how does it relate to your spy life?
His name is Jose Cohen Valdez.
Okay.
That's his full name. And Jose, everyone who's called Jose in Spanish, we call him Pepe.
Okay. All right.
That's how that works. So
Pepe. Gotcha. All right.
He goes by Pepe Cohen or Jose Cohen. Anyways, my wife and I went to Cuba. We were invited by the Cuban government, by Fidel Castro, through its Ministry of Interior. And I told you the other day how I got there all the way through Canada and said,
oh, yeah.
We went all around.
Multiple passports, like, oh my God.
People will simply have to look at your previous video there. Anyway, I won't go over that again. But the point is, we got to meet Pepe, as we called him. Even to this day, we know him as Pepe. And what happened was, I had my controller in Mexico City, and his name was Julian Rosa. That was his alias. His real name was Orlando Betancourt, and we found out about that through Pepe when we went on the island. But it turns out when we arrived at the Marti airport, Orlando, in other words, Julian Rosa, my controller, he was there to meet us because now we had a new controller in Mexico. Okay, so we have a new handler, and so since he knew us, he's the guy who received at the foot of the airplane, and the first person he introduced to us was Pepe Cohen. Okay, and he said, "This is one of our finest," and Pepe was a fanatic communist up to that moment. Okay, and he was designated as our chaperone around the island. So they took us to Pinar del Rio on the western side of Cuba, where they have the combinado, where they made the chips over there. Okay, where all the information was going to that part of the island, to the western side of the island, and they took us also to other parts of Cuba. Okay, not to Guantanamo, never. Anyway, the point is that throughout the 2 weeks that we were with him, that he took us around the island, we had a lot of discussions. And I mean, discussions, there were debates and discussions. And partly he was a fanatic follower of Fidel Castro. And he defended the revolution. He defended Fidel Castro. And I couldn't badmouth the revolution too much, right? But at the same time, I thought I'd point out some of the deficiencies. And so I would do it through jokes, like saying, we were walking down the streets and Pepe would say something like, "Did you notice that the streets are clean? There are no candy wrappers or anything like that on the streets?" And I would give him a little punch in the nose and say, "Well, really, in a country that has no candies, there can't be any candy wrappers." So I would throw some low blows, okay? And he picked up on them, but he was trying to convince me that the revolution was on the right track and everything and so on. Well, the point is, after 2 weeks, I think he got the idea that we were not too enthused with the revolution, that there were lots of problems in Cuba. And one of those big problems was that when they toured us, they took us to model everything, model schools, model constructions, model factories. Everything was modeled. It was not the ordinary middle of the road. It was just the best that Cuba had to offer. And even so, it was in pretty bad shape. Now, we didn't expect nothing out of the ordinary from Cuba because, again, everybody thinks of Cuba as a banana republic. In fact, it's shaped like a banana. Okay. And so you think of it as a banana republic. You cannot expect for it to be, like Germany or some other advanced nation. But at the same time, there were many problems that were due to inefficiency. That's the issue. And so, what happened was we pointed these things out, even though we were treated like royalty. And and when we left, I think he wrote a report to Fidel Castro. I'm sure they requested a report from him, Ministry of Interior. And I don't think he treated, I don't know what the report said to this day, but I'm sure that he didn't treat us very well in the sense that saying, oh, these are gung-ho people, these are great people, I think he probably told the truth and said, look, these people are losing heart with the revolution, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the way his report read. So the second time when we went to Cuba, we went again a couple of years later. And at that time, I think they were prepared for us. In other words, they weren't prepared in the sense that they didn't know we were coming. We just showed up. But the first thing I did was make contact with the Interior Ministry, and they immediately put Pepe in charge of chaperoning us again. But by this time, things have changed, and they started working to turn us around, to turn us into a different type of agent. They really wanted us to infiltrate the CIA without us knowing, without us being aware of it.
Okay.
So they used Pepe, who was our friend, to convince us that he had changed his mind about the revolution, that he was no longer a revolutionary, that thanks to the chats that he had with me, he changed his mind, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
And so he approaches us and he talks to us at the Riviera Hotel. Now, we were at the St. John's, a lousy 10th, no-star hotel.
Star hotel.
It was a no-star hotel. It had no hot water, for example, just to give you an idea. So they moved us, the Cuban government says, no, we're not going to let you stay there. We're going to move you to the Riviera. And we said, well, don't bother. It's okay. And they moved us anyways. They moved us to the Riviera. And that's when Pepe came one day and said, confess to us, I've changed my mind. I want to overthrow this. I want to overthrow Fidel Castro, blah, blah, blah. And we started having this subversive reunions. We had several of those, okay? And what happened was we went back to the States, and what they wanted us to do is to begin planning on getting him out of the island. So when I went back to the States, I tried to prepare a couple passports to get him and his wife and the kids, his kid, he had 3 kids, get them, all 5 of them out of the country. We went back, this was in January of 92. We went back in June of 92 again, but this time we told them in advance. We told our handler in Mexico that we were going to Cuba. We went again to Cuba, this time through Mexico. And when we get there, Pepe introduces us to a new member of the group, which he called PR2, Partido Revolucionario number 2. Number 1 was Jose Marti. I was a Revolutionary Party number 2, PR2. So now we were PR2, it was my wife, me, Pepe, and the guy he introduces to us, which is Rolando Sarraff Trujillo. We called him Roly, okay? He introduced Roly to us as a friend from high school. He said we did high school together. And we finally decided to found the courage to confess to each other that we both hated the revolution. He works also in the Ministry of Interior. He works in the M15, which was the group that did spying on the spies, spying on their own people. So if someone was out of line, they would tell Fidel Castro, look, this guy, I think he lost his revolutionary fervor. They were tattletales, essentially, okay? Oh. And that's where Roly worked, because he studied journalism, okay? So what happens? The 2 of them, incite us and tell us to go to the CIA. They give us information which they allegedly pulled out of the Ministry of Interior. They gave it to us. We come back to the States, and my wife wanted to kill me, but I went to the CIA and I turned myself in. That's essentially what happened.
Yeah. And then you told me about that in your last interview. Okay.
And so I confessed to them. And then 45 days later, the FBI appears at my house in Austin, Texas. And from there, we began a 2-year relationship with the agencies. And what happened was that, just to make a long story short, the FBI convinced me that these people were not for real, that Fidel Castro was behind them. even though they turned over some very important information according to the FBI, they still didn't believe them. And they were not about to send someone over to Cuba, someone from the CIA or some intelligence agency, to get them out, because they didn't know if it was a setup and Fidel Castro would get that guy and put him, on TV for the world to see. Look what the Americans are doing, blah, 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 And so they weren't going to risk it, because they said, we don't believe these people. We don't think they're for real. We think Fidel is behind this whole thing. And so they never really risked anything. And meanwhile, they kept sending information through me to the FBI. Okay. And so, we had these things. There's a lot more going on. But the point here is the following. A few years later, in 1994, Pepe leaves the island on a raft. He gets out of there. The FBI, the CIA, no one ever went after him. He had to leave on his own. He left on a raft. Okay, he leaves and arrives in Miami today. He's an Amway salesman who's doing quite well. Okay, that's
nice.
How he did. He's a used car salesman, very fast talker. He convinced a lot of people. More important is the guy that in 2015 was let go, was exchanged by Obama. Obama exchanged 3 prisoners that they had of the Cubans who were serving some time in American prisons, and which the Cubans wanted back. And they exchanged these 3 fellows who were in American prisons for 2 people. One of them was Alan Gross, who had been taken over there or had been arrested on charges of doing something with internet, some communication stuff. The other fellow was Rolando Sarraff Trujillo, Mr. Roly, my good old friend, my good old buddy. And he had been in prison for 20 years. What happened here, what really happened here was Obama went to Cuba, or they discussed with Raul Castro, right? The new president, because Fidel had retired by then, had discussed with Raul Castro, look, we can give you these 3 guys and maybe we can open up relations between Cuba and the United States. What's standing in the way is that you guys got this guy, Alan Gross, and we got these 3 Cubans that what you want, and we need to reach some kind of agreement. And so they said, well, if you give us Alan Gross, he's not really a spy. And if you do give us him as a spy, people will say, he was a spy, wasn't he? And so we don't want that. And so they pitched in, they said, who can we pitch in? And they thought about Roly. He was the perfect candidate. He was a perfect candidate because no one knew anything about him. The Interior Ministry had been revamped completely after Pepe left the island because he had too much information, so they had to redo everything. And it turns out that when Pepe left, they immediately recalled Roly from Russia. He was in Moscow. He was some kind of attaché in the Cuban embassy in Moscow. They recalled him. When he arrived at Marti, they arrested him. They tried him. And in that trial, Pepe's wife was kind of forced to testify against him, that he was part of a cell and blah, 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 bunch of lies, because the Cuban government knew he was in a cell because the cell was prepared by Fidel. So they had him, they had the goods on him, but they turned back around, they stabbed him in the back. Why? Because they realized that Roly was about to defect as well from Russia. And so they said, come over here. We got a raise for you. We're going to promote you. And they promoted him to prison. And he spent 20 years in prison. And they gave him 25 years, but he served 20 years, most of that time in solitary, by the way. And it turns out they didn't let him go. And they would have executed him if it weren't because his parents were from the Cuban Revolution of 1959. They were supporters of that revolution. They were part of the army, etc. And Fidel, as a deference to them, they said, look, we're going to put him in prison. And they left him in prison for 20 years. No one knew anything about Roly here in the States, right? Nobody knew anything anyways about the Interior Ministry because it was revamped, completely refurbished, right? Changed completely. And so here they said, look, we can invent any story about this guy because nobody knows anything about him. And so they invented the story that he gave the codes to the United States to catch, spies in the United States, American spies that were spying against the U.S. government in favor of Cuba. And so they use that. They say, oh, it was Roly, that he gave us the codes. And that's why they arrested him, right?
Okay.
And it turns out that Roly had nothing to do with codes. He knew nothing about cryptography. He was a journalist. Fidel Castro was not that desperate that he used journalists to do cryptography. That's done by mathematicians, okay? Pepe's wife was a mathematician. She was in the cryptography department, 2 different ones at different times. And they didn't arrest her. They let her go, but they arrested Roly and locked him up. So here they let Roly go. Okay, he comes to the United States. The 3 Cubans that went to Cuba to see Raul Castro, they were put on TV, heroes, blah blah blah. Alan Gross came here. To the States. He was treated as a hero. Also, the U.S. flag behind him. He talked to the press. Everything. Roly, he was whisked in secret. No one was able to interview him or even talk to him. They said they had to debrief him. Debrief for what? I mean, after 20 years in prison, he's got nothing to be debriefed about.
Yeah, that's true.
If you look up Rolando Sarraff Trujillo, that's his name, right? If you look him up, you won't find any information in the last 20 years. You won't find any kind of information in the last 20 years on him.
Well, that's how it happens sometimes, unfortunately.
Yeah, you won't find any information on him because for the last 7 years, no one has interviewed him. No one knows anything about him. The thing just the journalists, the news agencies, they all dropped the ball on it. No one followed up and said, well, who was this guy that Obama released? Nobody knows anything about him to this day. Nobody cares. He just died by pocket veto.
Oh, man.
So that's the issue. But if you want to know the story of Rolando Sarraff Trujillo, you came to the right guy. The guy was exchanged by Obama. You got to go to my site. I had written 5 articles on that. Okay, big articles that you can see. You see the whole story of him and Pepe in there, what actually happened from my point of view. Okay. And what you're going to see there, you go to youstupidrelativist.com, youstupidrelativist.com. If you go there, you look for Rolando Sarraff Trujillo. You'll see it on the lower left in the English section. And there you can read all about him. And I've got some videos on him as well, like 5 videos or whatever. And you'll see the whole story there if you really want to interested in what happened to these 2 fellows, Jose Cohen and Rolando Sarraff Trujillo.
Awesome. Fantastic story arc. I think it actually spanned in all 3 interviews, because I think even in the first one, you kind of talked about your spy life and how you were, turned over by the CIA and stuff. But Captain Jose Pepe, it was the most high-ranking person that worked under Fidel Castro that you met?
No. He was not. He was only a lieutenant, in fact. But sometimes those people are more valuable, like the FBI told me. They're more valuable because they're in the day-to-day things. They knew the little details. See, when you get one of these generals, when you get a colonel, someone up there, they have the general picture. And they might have some obviously they would have information that the CIA would be interested in because they have this big picture view of things. But then when you get a lieutenant, someone at the lower level, not only does he know the buddies that work with him, the names, etc., and he knows them, he knows their real names, right? Where they live, how many kids they have. He knows all the details, right? But he also knows the day-to-day operations of what's going on inside the offices, and what they do and how they do it, the procedures. They have a lot of information that is very useful. And the CIA did try to get, or was planning on, or was intent on getting both Pepe, Roly, and Pepe's wife out of there. They were trying to get them out, but they wouldn't risk it under the eyes of Fidel Castro. And they're right.
Gotcha, yeah. So who was the person who had like the most authority under Fidel that you met in person? Because I know you never met him, but...
Yeah, I met several person. I met the Minister of Electronics. His name was Rojas. I met the head of the M6R group in the Ministry of the Interior. We worked for the my cell was the M6. The M6 was charged with eluding the American embargo, especially on technological stuff. That's why I ended up with them. And the head of that was Colonel Broche. His name was, and he went by the name of Marco. That was his alias. His name was Agustin Broche. He was a colonel at the time, probably ascended to general at some point. And he was a big man. A very intelligent fellow, by the way. You know, Fidel chooses his people very carefully.
I bet, you know.
Yeah, so, you know, I met a lot of these people. I met Rene. That was also his nom de guerre. His true name was Onelio Beovides. And Onelio escaped Cuba, quotations, very much quotations, because it turns out that one of the reasons we turned ourselves in for the second time, we escaped from the FBI, the CIA. We were 8 months on the road. They couldn't find us. And finally, because of things that happened, we decided to turn ourselves in for the second time to the FBI. I gave them a call, told them my whereabouts. And the reason we did was Onelio Beovides had escaped the island. Now, that was so tricky that it was very hard to believe for the FBI. We bought it because we were very naive with my wife, right, about these things. But the FBI convinced us that that doesn't happen. What had happened was that this was a story they told us. Pepe told us this from Cuba. He said, look, someone overheard Onelio Beovides, you know, Rene, overheard him say something anti-revolutionary. And so they took him out of his job, and he was Pepe's boss. He was
Okay.
He was between Colonel Broche and Pepe. He was a major in the army, and he was over Pepe. And so they put him aside until they did their investigation. Listen to the story. This is what they told us, that they put him aside. They took him out of there, you know, for security reasons, and they were investigating him. But they put him to work at the Martí airport, already very suspicious, like, you know, a baggage handler or whatever he was doing. But what was he doing in the Martí airport? You would think they would put him in the fields cutting cane, right? Or maybe keep him out of a job for a while until they investigate. No, the story goes, he was put to work at the Martí airport. While at the Martí airport, he fabricated a passport, a fake passport. This is the story they told us. He fabricated a fake passport, got on an Aeroflot flight out of Cuba without no one knowing, apparently, because he had a different name in his passport. He lands in Ireland. The flight continued to Moscow, but he turns himself to the authorities in Ireland, who called the CIA, who came and picked him up, who took him to Washington, D.C. And while he was in Washington, D.C., being drilled over there, we were being drilled in Austin, Texas by the FBI and the CIA. So that was the story.
Dance the jig in Ireland, the beer. Yeah, I mean, like, sounds a little too, contrived. Like, sounds a little too elaborated to be something that actually happened. Oh, well.
Well, yeah. What did happen, what was the reality of that was that, yes, he did escape Cuba. He did land in Ireland. He was picked up by the CIA, brought to the United States, to Washington, D.C. That part happened because they confirmed, look, we've got Onelio, in other words, Rene, we've got him over there in Washington. And they were asking him questions, putting him through lie detectors, maybe waterboarding him. I don't know. I was never waterboarded.
Yeah. Dang.
And they were questioning us and put us through lie detectors in Austin, Texas. And they were doing the same thing to him over there. They were checking
the lie detector on you?
I'm sorry?
They used the lie detector on you too?
Several times. I had like 7 or 8 lie detectors taken on me. But this is the issue. The issue is they were questioning him. They were questioning me. And so the issue was, why, of all people in Cuba, a guy who knew me, whom I knew him, it turns out that this is the guy that happens to escape out of Cuba for saying something anti-revolutionary for being put to work at the airport where he fabricated a passport, and without anybody knowing, he gets on an airplane and flies out of Cuba. That part was, for Hollywood. People
Gotcha.
the FBI had very hard time believing that all that happened on the island. The other part is true. He did land in Ireland. He landed in Dublin, and from there he was picked up and brought to the States.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thank you for concluding that story. All righty. And then before we close out, do you have any? I know you do. Do you still do lectures like around other countries and stuff? Or do you just do them at your house? Because I know sometimes you were like at some conferences or whatever, or you made like a PowerPoint slide about your views on physics and stuff. Do you still do that?
Yeah, we've had a conference almost every year. We suspended because of the COVID, so we've been out of that for like
that's right.
years. And but I think we might start again. There's one offer to do the next one maybe in Mexico. So we got to see how these things work out. That's just one possibility. There are others we're exploring, and we might get together. We have a staunch group of people who are interested in the theory and who want to explore it and develop it further. And a couple of people have written books on it. So we'll see. Maybe we get together in some country again and continue on with the rope model of light and gravity.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad some other people are picking up on it. That is awesome. All righty. Well, thanks again for another fantastic interview. And in a couple of minutes, I will have this posted on my Freethinker podcast, and then you can, distribute it on your site, and then, share it on your Facebook page. Do whatever you like with it.
Okay. We'll see you.
All righty. Thank you. Have a good day.